So I did my spiritual review of Beyonce's 2016 film Lemonade, and y'all was in the comments like, please do Black is King next. So let's talk about Black is King from a spiritual perspective. Black is King is Beyonce's film that dropped in July of 2020 when the world was physically sleeping, but in the midst of a spiritual awakening. During that time, the Black Lives Matter movement was happening, and people had more time to focus on researching their history, getting to know themselves beyond just the physical, but understanding the power of their cultural identity, especially as Black people. Black is King tells the story of a young man understanding who he is, understanding his power in reclaiming his rightful crown as king. It really reimagined the story of the Lion King, but centered Black identity as the true source of power. Let's get into it. One of the major themes of Black is King is understanding that you were blessed before you were even born, that you were born into a soul contract that automatically deemed you as royalty. And our journey throughout this life is a journey of reclaiming your identity, knowing who you are, and moving in your rightful power. Then the film shows a rites of passage ceremony where a young child, a baby, is being blessed by its ancestors before being released into the water. And this is the first rites of passage that we all experience. It is symbolic of all of us being blessed by our ancestors and our spirit guides before we are released into the water of the womb. Before you were born, you were blessed to be royalty. You were blessed to be abundant. You were blessed to be well. Wellness is your birthright. And unfortunately, this world has conditioned us to detach from our birthrights. So we stop reclaiming our throne because many of us fall into the cycle of sexism, racism, capitalism, classism, and so many of the isms that have stifled us. So another theme that appears throughout Black is King is the journey of life, which looks like doing the work to overcome these obstacles of isms. Stop falling into these traps and reclaim your identity and your rightful power. And this is what we call the journey of gaining knowledge of self. Throughout the entire film, there is this blue man. And I really love the character of the blue man because throughout the entire film of the young boy kind of losing his identity and falling for the traps of his uncle, who is Scar, who's doing this hand movement that makes him drop his scepter in the water, drop his identity as king, and he emerges from the water not knowing who he is. But the entire time, this blue man and his ancestor, which I'll talk about later, are following him through his journey of life, of understanding who he is, of gaining knowledge of self and reclaiming his identity. This blue man is his Ori. Your Ori is your highest divine self, but sometimes your Ori becomes your shadow because it is repressed due to societal conditioning. Your Ori is your spirit guide. Your Ori guides you and leads you throughout this life and helps you step into this power and move and lead with spirit, lead with your highest divine self, and make the decisions that you need to make to lead you to your divine destiny. But again, society will repress that Ori, and our Ori often becomes our shadow. So this blue man is representative of his Ori, but also now his shadow self, who has been repressed due to societal conditioning. And Beyonce, who was dressed in white, represents his ancestor. The same ancestor who blessed him before he was born is the same ancestor who is watching over him as he lives his life. One of my favorite themes throughout Black is King is that your ancestors, your spirit guides, your Ori is always watching over you and protecting you. I love the fact that Beyonce, who represents the ancestor, and the blue man, who represents his Ori, is shown together many times as he's making decisions throughout his life, as he's traveling to the mansion to live this elaborate life, which really goes against his true, authentic destiny as king. They are watching over him as he's reclaiming his identity in already and finding out who he truly is as king. They are watching over him and reminding him of who he truly is, which is really what our ancestors, our spirit guides, and our highest divine self, our Ori, does. Now, the two major themes of gaining knowledge of self and reclaiming your power were consistent throughout Black is King, but a sub-theme that was able to present through these major themes was the challenge of Black masculinity. The question was constantly asked, What does it mean to be king? What does it mean to step into your power? What does that look like? Oh, and I have to acknowledge the Afrofuturism that Find Your Way Back gave us. When the young boy begins his journey of really finding his way back to his identity, we get this Afrofuturistic scene where really it is the future generations telling him to find your way back. We are who we are. It is in your destiny. Go back and reclaim your throne. I love this. Now, the young boy was being guided by his father the entire time, first in physical and then in ancestor realm. And his father told him, you were blessed to be king by the kings who came before you. And those kings are represented by these ancestors in masks. But he knew that he had to discover what was the definition of kinghood for himself. How will he show up as king? And that's when we get to see him be a king in different ways, which once again challenges the idea, the concept of Black masculinity as it shows up. And that's when we get to see the beautiful duality through juxtaposition of two forms of being a king. In one way, we get to see the boy dreaming of living this lavish life where he pulls up to a mansion, and that's when we get Mood Forever, where it's actually Jay-Z pulling up to a mansion and his beautiful wife Beyonce waking up, and they are both living this life of lavish and luxury. And this is really showing us the more overt capitalistic aspect of being royalty and living in your power, right? By living this lavish, rich, luxurious life. Is that what kinghood is? Or does being a king mean being the most lit dude in the hood that everybody looks up to? And this is represented in the scene where they are playing Jada Jada, and the king, the young boy, is riding through the hood in a decked out hearse. And I found that this symbolism was so powerful because the hearse was lit, which could represent the glorification of unaliving in the hood. But the real question is that even what kinghood is? And another theme that was spoken about throughout the film was duality. Okay, y'all, I'm gonna do a part 2 where I can come back and talk more about other themes in the film, like duality, the sacred masculine and divine feminine, also a lot more of the spiritual symbolism. I promise I'm not gonna keep y'all waiting for long. Part 2 is coming soon. Get into it. This is part 2 of my spiritual review of Beyonce's film Black is King, which was released in 2020. Now, in part 1, I talked all about the major themes of ancestor guidance, of following your Ori, of gaining knowledge of self and reclaiming your power. Now, this is part 2 where we're going to talk about more themes in spiritual symbolism. Let's get into it. And this is when I want to bring attention to the cover of The Gift, which is Beyonce's album that Black is King was actually the visual of. If you look at this cover, it is representative of a battle for power where you have one lion chasing the other and one is actually catching the tail of the other, which is a sign of potential defeat. Now, with the yin and yang, it represents duality. It represents almost a divine balance. Now, in the film, when we transition from Mood Forever, which is one depiction of power, to Jada Jada, which is another depiction of power, wealth versus poverty, right? We have this idea or this question being asked, what does duality look like for you? Jay-Z is narrating that portion and he says good and evil can both appear at the same time. And throughout the film, there is this constant narration about duality, about this divine balance between good and evil, rich and poor, and so many other things. Right? It's a beautiful, beautiful question to ask yourself. What does balance look like within you? How does duality show up within you? And speaking of duality, we have to acknowledge that yes, Black is King is centering Black manhood. It's centering the sacred masculine, but it also does a beautiful job of appreciating the divine feminine energy. First and foremost, throughout the entire film, he is being guided and protected by his divine feminine ancestor. Also, his rites of passage is led by his divine feminine ancestors. Now, there is a narration that occurs where there's a man speaking and he's saying, look, a lot of my lessons and wisdom came from women. And then we transition into Brown Skin Girl, where the sisters are acknowledged, the beauty and the power of the sisters are acknowledged. And of course, we have to talk about how when the young boy goes on a journey of reclaiming his identity and he has to battle his own uncle for his rightful place as king, he ends up having a team of woman warriors. And that's when we transition to power. They'll never take my power, my power, my power. And the women run Scar out of the kingdom, and the boy is able to reclaim his rightful place on the throne as king. So the theme of duality is also present even in that, in presenting the story of the sacred masculine, the self-discovery of masculinity, while also acknowledging the importance and the wisdom, the nurturing, the lessons, and the warrior energy of the divine feminine, which we all have a combination of both. That dual energy of sacred masculine and divine feminine is resting in all of us. The question is, which aspect are you tapping into and when? And of course, speaking of the divine feminine, I have to acknowledge how throughout the entire film, Beyonce has various representations of the Orishas showing up, especially the divine feminine Orishas. Of course, in one of the songs, she acknowledges that she has her Oshun energy. And then in the film, she also has a narration where she says the Orishas are watching you and guiding you. And this is after the boy reclaims his power and reclaims his rightful place on the throne. She reminds him who the Orishas are and that he has always been guided and protected by the Orishas. Another way duality shows up is in the form of adversaries, right? Sometimes in that dual energy, it is your own family who is supposed to love and protect you, who ends up being your enemy. That is a duality within itself. Blood and family and love versus jealousy and hatred and envy, which leads to a battle of power. That is the battle between Mufasa and Scar, but then transitions to the battle between Scar and Simba, who is his nephew, right? And behind Scar, we have the symbol of duality, which is the two lions battling or chasing each other, which is the cover of Beyonce's The Gift album. Now, another symbolism that I have to acknowledge throughout Black is King is the moon. They were constantly panning to the moon throughout the film, and the moon has so much ancestral connection to Black people specifically. The moon was one of our timekeepers. Yes, our ancestors used the sun to tell time of day, but the moon was how we track time of month, right? This is how we kept up with our months. We often were lunar people, and we tracked the cycle of the year via months through the moon. So the moon is an ancestral timekeeper. The moon is also connected to divine feminine energy. The full moon is attributed to the Orisha Yemoja, and the new moon or the dark moon is attributed to the Orisha Oya. And of course, I have to talk about the symbolism of water throughout the entire film. The film began and ended at the water. It's important for us to acknowledge that water is a cleanser. It is a purifier. It is also used to bless and enchant. It is a manifester. Water also holds memory, and that was shown all throughout this film. It's important to realize that at the beginning of the film, the baby was blessed at the water by water. His feet was washed with water. The young boy was blessed with his markings, his sigils, to acknowledge that he was king at the water. The boy was dipped in the water where he lost his scepter and lost his connection to his kinghood, but that scepter remained in the water. The water held the memory of who he was, and he had to return to the water to reclaim his scepter and reclaim his power. The water held his identity. The water held the memory of who he was, and when he returned to that water, he reclaimed that scepter and reclaimed his power. He stepped into his power and was manifested as king at that water. When the young boy was on the journey to rediscover himself and reclaim his identity, he was told to go to the water because that's where his true self was. And at the water was the blue man, also known as his Ori, his highest divine self. And when he went to the water, he found who he was. He dipped himself back in that water. He grabbed his scepter, which represented his power and identity as a king, and he emerged from the water, manifested as his true, authentic self. Now, it's important to acknowledge that Black is King was centering power identified through the lens of Black masculinity, aka kinghood, right? Because this film was dedicated to Beyonce's son, Sir Carter, which I love that so much. At the end, they had like a little ode to him. It was so beautiful. But it's important to acknowledge that this film was about Black identity as a whole and stepping into your power as a Black person by acknowledging your culture from Africa all throughout the diaspora. She elevated the beauty of Black culture in Africa and all throughout the diaspora through hairstyles, through clothes, through scenery and environment, through words and messaging. But she also showed the Pan-African flag, right? And that flag represents the coming together of all Black people to realize that Black is truly king. Overall, Black is King is a film that is all about knowledge of self. It's all about knowing who you are and reclaiming your power. It's about knowing that you are a divine being who is being divinely guided by God, your spirit guides, and your ancestors. It is about tapping into your highest divine self, connecting with your Ori and letting it guide you to make the right decisions. It's about being divinely balanced and tapping into your own duality, your sacred masculine and divine feminine. It's about having appreciation for all that is around you and know that you are a great thing. You are a divine reflection, and royalty is your birthright.